Okay, why don't we get started? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest session in this series. It's been really interesting so far. I'm sure this one's going to be great too. I hope you all had a chance to peruse or completely read the book, Station 11, and at least saw some connections between Shakespeare's King Lear and the novel. And I know Mark's going to elaborate on that. A reminder, the final session of the series, session number 7, is in 2.5 weeks. So it's going to be on Thursday, like the previous ones, and it's November 2. So next week and the week after, we're taking a break because of Mark's schedule and our schedule. And Thursday, November 2 is when we're going to wrap up the series. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for everyone for coming. Let me give the note that if you haven't read but have a copy of Cloud Cuckoo Land, it looks much bigger and more daunting than it is. It's very compartmentalized in a way that's very readable. It moves from one time frame to another. There are 3 time frames, but it always tells you where you are. And I think of it as a very readable novel, just as I thought of Station 11. So Station 11 is now nearly a decade old. It was turned into a very popular miniseries. It came out in 2014, and the following year it won the Arthur C. Clarke Annual Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that one of the characters' name is Arthur, and his best friend is named Clarke, because she had him in mind, not getting the prize, but the very celebrated science fiction author, Arthur Clarke. So yes, I do hope it's clear to you now why King Lear and the lecture I gave was important, not just because King Lear is being performed in this play, but in this novel, but that what I said about King Lear and what his tragic flaw is, and that what he had to learn was that personal, familial, and political connections are not made through power. They're made through fundamentally imagination, kindness, community, love, but at the center of that is imagination. I hope that was clear. And one of the things that this novel made clear is that if you are trying to make a survival society, not necessarily utopia, but if you're starting from scratch, one possibility is to go the right route of Tyler, the prophet, and go for power. Power in the name of God, which is often the sponsor that people cite and can be a very formidable thing, especially if it's connected to murderousness, which is the case of the prophet, this kind of marauder in this little boy now grown into a kind of monster. But another possibility is to embrace the world of imagination, which is what Kirsten and the Traveling Symphony do. It's a pretty stark comparison between the Traveling Symphony and the cult of the prophet's followers. Early on in the novel, which begins with a performance of King Lear and introduces us not only to Arthur, but to Jivan, who's an important character, and to Kirsten and to the backstory. She's almost exactly the age of Tyler, the 2 children at the beginning of the novel. One, someone who is a professional associate, even at her young age, with Arthur Leander, and the other one, the son, the only person he seems really to love, as the novel makes clear by the end. And they're significant because they each get a copy of the Station 11 graphic novel that Miranda created. And it's influential on both their lives in radically different ways. So the first part of the novel, and there are 9 parts and a total of 55 chapters. The first one, which is called The Theater, ends with chapter 6, and the whole of chapter 6 is a page and a half. In the interest of time, I won't read it all, but it begins an incomplete list. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No ball game played under floodlights. No more porch lights. No more third rail. no more films. It goes down, and the entire list, with only a few exceptions, is basically about not having electricity, not having power, not having technology. It makes a little sidestep with pharmaceuticals. It talks about no more internet, no more reading and commenting on the lives of others, and in so doing, feeling slightly left alone in the room. No more avatars. That is, no more electronic versions of yourself. So early on in the novel, and that list is not ascribed to anybody. So it's the novel telling us these are the things that were the partial list of deprivations uh, after the pandemic. That's not what this novel is about. That's why it's given early and dismissed. This novel is not trying to get back electricity, although at the end of the novel, electric lights is a sign of civilization. This novel wants to get back to what it believes is the core of civilization. And it's a lesson of what Lear learned about imagination. So we've done only a handful of possible utopias. Hundreds of utopian novels were written before 1900, and many, many hundreds since then. This is not an exhaustive list, but one way utopias are created is along some kind of philosophical or religious measure. Another is to think in terms of government and economy, the way power should be mediated. Another is to think in terms of the delivery of services, whether it's education or medicine, how a plan, how rationality can make for a better life for people. Other kinds of utopias are ecological, getting more in step with nature. Some of them are very heavily engineering based. How do we actually design the way you might design a machine, a well-run society? What none that I've ever seen says that the core of a good life in a new world, if you were creating it from scratch or trying to recreate it from devastation, is the imagination. This book suggests that what you need to do to get back on your feet is to embrace art. And although Lear himself does not talk about art, the point that I was making, I hope successfully last time, is that Lear has to stop being reasonable and start being imaginative. He has to get in touch with his imagination, which is connected to empathy and sympathy and feeling, and realize who Cordelia is even when she says nothing. He has to realize how wrong-headed he is in trying to think about using his head instead of his heart. And because he's stubborn and old and powerful, and because it's one of Shakespeare's great tragedies, he has to be broken by nature. He has to be broken by his mistake. And although he is redeemed in the end by believing his dead daughter is alive, that is, he imagines her alive. And in the play, that's not a falseness, it's a truth of feeling. It's a terrible thing, an awesome thing in the root sense, awe-inspiring, to see what people have to go through to be bent and broken into a better shape. If he were a minor character, he wouldn't have to go through such suffering. If he were in a comedy, there'd be no suffering at all. He would be tricked or massaged into a better shape. But it is truly a play that shows the terrible cost of a man of power who once was a great man in his decline, who is fixating on numbers and rationality rather than feeling. So what Kirsten represents in the play, and we're told she loves acting more than anything, she has that in common with Arthur, is she loves the idea of artifice. The traveling symphony is a matter of music and plays and stories. They have a 2-year cycle in their repertoire, and they do a lot of Shakespeare, including King Lear and Midsummer Night's Dream, two very different plays. I want to point out a few things, and then I want to ask you if you would comment And I hope with more discussion than we had last time, that's not a scold, but I hope maybe this is a more accessible book, and maybe in the context of my lecture, which again I hope was helpful. Uh, at the core of the salvation of the world in this novel is art. And you may not have noticed, but the first and most important, in the sense of central character, is Arthur Leander. His first name is Art, A-R-T, Arthur, and his last name has an L, E-A, and an R at the end. It has Lear in his last name. If you remove some letters but not rearrange anything, he'd be Art Lear. And he is a consummate actor. He's not a very good person. He's not a very successful person. He's a philanderer. He's a serial husband. It's made clear in the novel when we see inside his mind at the end that really the only thing he loved, the only person he loved besides himself, is his son. And regrettably, his son is more influenced by the religious mother than the acting father, and turns into the prophet. Um, I do think that pun is intended. I'm not sure Arthur and Clark is intended in the way I suggested. The woman who is the shipping executive, but is the creator of the graphic novel of Dr. 11 and Station 11, her name is Miranda Carroll. And Miranda is the name of the young, inexperienced daughter of Prospero in Twelfth Night, one of Shakespeare's truly great plays. I recently did with the Richfield Library the first novel in a series of AI gone haywire that's being done by Zoom. And we did Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me, which is 5 or 6 years old. And the significant female in that book is named Miranda. It's Miranda, who has been kept by her father from seeing human beings, who sees the shipwrecked men and says famously, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." She is impressed by humanity. And it's Miranda Carroll who writes a book, draws a book for her own purposes. It's not about performing the way her husband does or Kirsten does. It's not about money or commerce. It's a private passion project that's very important to her. She is the consummate artist in the book, creating for her own purposes and creating something that turns out to be very influential on at least 2 young readers who encounter it. And there's a description near the end when it goes back to the day that Arthur dies and he's having a conversation with his son. He's giving away what he calls comic books, the 2 copies given by Miranda, one to his son and one to, you could say, his putative daughter in Kirsten. And one of them, as I said, goes in one direction and one goes in the other. But Miranda is someone who creates a brave new world, science fiction. And whatever the moral of that story is, it is imaginative art. And the book is loaded with all kinds of art and artifice, artifacts, things that are created. So I'm just going to give you a partial list. There's the tea set, airplanes, Arthur's box of memorabilia. There are the actual physical comics. There's the DV book. There's a Museum of Civilization, which is not so much a collection of art in the sense that a museum of modern art, but of artifacts, which is another kind of art. What artifacts and art have in common is that they're artificial, they're made. And an artifact is something created and has a factual presence. So cell phones and microwave would be artifacts, especially if they no longer exist. The paperweight that makes transit from one person to another, refrigerators, the grave markers, the tattoos that people wear, the performance of King Lear of Midsummer Night's Dream, Diallo's oral history, remember he's a librarian, the Dear V book that Arthur's childhood friend Veronica writes. and on and on and on. The book is obsessed with either art in the more high-minded sense of connecting people to high achievements, to good feeling, to getting outside themselves by seeing performances of people pretending to be people they're not. One of the great enjoyments of art is that sort of pretense. And then artifacts, which have the other dimension, which is they root people back to the world they knew that is now gone. Now, most of the people in the novel that we meet, because they're the traveling symphony people, are much more interested in the first than the second. Kirsten and her friends are much more interested in the traveling sympathy. And remember, symphony by itself is an image of community, of concord. Clark is the person most interested in the artifacts. He creates the Museum of Civilization, partly because he's not doing so well in a post-pandemic world. He longs for the past. He feels his corporate experience is empty, quite different from Miranda's experience as a corporate executive. She doesn't have any kind of burnout. And so he populates the museum with artifacts from his nostalgia. In and of itself, the museum is not a bad thing, but he's one of the unhealthy characters in the book. I have, for the last 20 years or so, avoided reading reviews of books that my book groups or libraries choose because they reveal too much about the plot or things I don't want to know until I've read the book. And so I only read the reviews after I read this book, which I very much admired and still admire. I've done it with a number of book groups. And what I thought when I read the book is that these people do not seem to be very traumatized by the fact that the world has almost been completely erased. They are very healthy in general. And the bugaboo of the disaster, the catastrophe, is all concentrated in the prophet, who has something of a comic book character, which is, I think, very, very fine. I think this is a kind of sci-fi uh, mystery adventure story. The identity of the prophet may have given some of you pause, but the rest of the crew seems pretty well adjusted for a civilization that no longer has psychiatrists or medicine. They seem to have bounced back pretty easily. I don't know if that's a failure of the novel. She's written many novels. I've written none. I think it's probably because she's so concentrated, that is the author, so concentrated, Emily St. John Mandel, so concentrating on the power of art that she hasn't given enough weight to what it would be like to actually live in this world. That partial list in chapter 6 about all the things that are missing, it doesn't have any human dimension to it. It's not conceived by anyone. No one's thinking this is what I'll miss, which would humanize it. Whether it's a failure of her imagination or whether it's the plan that she meant, I leave for you and others to decide. But I do think that the novel is deeply invested in how well these people are served by art. What is good about life, in spite of where we are, we have to wait until the very end of the book, when it returns in circular fashion to that first night of Arthur's performance and death. And these are in the last chapters, and I'm thinking especially of chapter 55. Let me just make sure I have chapter 53. In this edition, one with the tents on the cover, it's on page 327. I'm sure it made an impression on you when you read it. We're thinking along with Arthur in his mind, though he says he repents nothing, or she says she repents nothing. He has at 51 the sheer volume of regret for things he didn't do right. And I won't read that long paragraph in the middle of the page, but it ends with, On the second night, he arrived at the platform with a strategy. He stared at his crown and ran through a secret list of everything that was good. So he's arguing with the director that he doesn't know what to do with himself in the staging where he's elevated on a platform and has to sit there as the audience files in. He's not happy about that. The second night, he decides to use his time by running through a secret list of everything that was good. That is something he's never shared with anyone. And this is worth reading in full. The pink magnolias in the backyard of a house in Los Angeles, outdoor concerts, the way the sound rises up into the sky. Notice the difference between that's an absence of electricity, but it's not the loss of electricity that's being lamented. It's the way the sound rises up into the sky. Tyler in the bathtub at 2, Elizabeth in the pool at night, dancing with Clark when they were both 18, their fake IDs in their pocket, Clark flickering in the strobe lights. Once again, not about the lights, but about Clark. Miranda's eyes, the way she looked at him when she was 25 and still loved him. His third wife, Lydia, doing yoga. The croissants at the cafe across the street from his hotel. Tanya sipping wine, her smile. Riding in his father's snowplow when he was 9, the time Arthur told a joke and his father and little brother couldn't stop laughing. The sheer joy he felt at that moment. And then appearing on the list a second time, Tyler. That's a great touch. For one thing, it humanizes Arthur more than anything that's come before, not only about his intense love for his son, but that there's a man who can appreciate, even though I think he felt lots of things wrong with him morally, appreciate things in their beauty. And much of what he appreciates has a kind of aesthetic value. Even telling a joke as a kid and having grown-ups laugh. And I can't be the only person in the Zoom meeting who's ever had that experience. The first time as a kid, 10, 9, 11, that you made grown-ups laugh by something you said or did is a very exciting experience. It's not an easy thing to do. These are all aesthetic things, whether it's nature like the magnolias or the joys of eating a croissant. I don't mean to say that there's not a physical dimension. Appreciating the physical presence and beauty of the various women he's married. It reminds us that although there is a great list of deprivations given early in the novel, mainly again about electricity and all that would be lost, there is a humanistic sense in this list, this secret list of things that are good. And whether it's secret because he's kind of a loner, whether it's secret because he doesn't want to admit that he has this kind of soft spot in him, it's hard to know. But the novel suggests that the essence of any healthy society is in its art. And of course, we're reading this in a book written by a novelist. And here I am on a laptop talking to you as a teacher of English. But I think it's striking that the versions of Utopia that we have seen, that the characters putting forth the Utopia, don't focus much on art. And so I'm going to stop there and ask if you have anything to say. I'd be especially gratified if you made some comment about the lecture last time and the book this time, not because I need my ego to be stroked, but we're looking now at 3 works: King Lear, this book, 21st century, the next book even later in our century, our present century, and another book that plays with the ancient world and the contemporary world. King Lear, 17th century, 100 years after More's Utopia, dominates this book in many ways, even when the name isn't being invoked. Cloud Cuckoo Land goes back to the ancient Greeks and goes forward into the future as a remarkable performance, I think. So, Michael, if you'll look for hands or chats or people want to pass on comments or questions, I'd be especially interested in comments.
Okay, well, we got one right off the bat. It says, Although King Lear is a tragedy, is there a tragic hero in the play? It seems unconvincing to argue that Lear overcomes his flaws via the ultimate manifestation of his love for Cordelia.
I'm sorry, it seems what was the adjective? It seems what to think that? That last
He
sentence?
overcomes his flaws via the
No,
ultimate
the whole last sentence. It seems something to think that Lear. What's the adjective at the beginning of that sentence?
It seems unconvincing to argue
Yeah.
that
So I think I don't think it's unconvincing to argue. What Shakespeare and the ancient Greek tragedians looked at was, does somebody have a moral understanding of the way the world works? Has someone actually changed their view, even if they don't change their actions, even if it's too late to act on their new knowledge, even if it's too late to save themselves? I think the Greek word was agnoresis. Do you have a recognition into the way the world works? And when Lear believes his daughter to be alive, he has learned something in his broken mind and his repaired heart. And I don't think it's unconvincing at all. He is a tragic hero because he learned too late a secret of the universe. And the heart of tragedy is there is a loss and there's a gain, and you cannot do the math. If you could say, you know what, it's well worth all the dead people in Verona now that the Montagues and the Capulets won't be killing each other in the future. That's a good outcome. Or it's a good outcome that Hamlet Jr. finally did what his father asked him to do in the first act of the play, even though many, many people are dead. Tragedy doesn't allow you to make a statement like that because it's not based on calculation. It is a horrible experience for Lear, and he learned something about the way the world works. To me, that's utterly convincing. That's the mark of a tragic hero.
Got
That's
it.
why it's tragic. You
Sure.
can't learn it the easy way.
The next comment says, what do you think about the role that fear plays in the creation and sustaining of utopias?
Well, I need more focus than that. Do you mean relative to this novel? Do you mean the fear that they have of the marauders of the prophet? I'm not sure how to place that question in what we're doing tonight.
Okay, we'll give that person a
Yeah,
second to
and
type
if
a
you
little
mean
more.
that if you mean that more broadly about utopias more generally, I'm going to ask to hold off on that question since I hope there's enough meat in this novel and its connection to Lear that we can focus on tonight and maybe bring up that question next time when we look at the course. Next time's the last time. Look in the court at the course in the rearview mirror.
Sure, well, we'll give that person a second to reformulate that comment a little. I'll mention one thing in the meantime in reaction to your comments about Clark's Museum. Another way of looking at Clark's Museum is as and a piece of conceptual art, which are often put together as installations with deliberate selection of particular things put in juxtaposition amongst themselves. So on the one hand, you could say it's a museum of artifacts, so it's not really about art as artwork, or maybe what he's been creating all this time is a work of conceptual art.
Yeah, Michael, I go further and say, yes, I think once you take artifacts and put them on display, whether the building is called a museum or not, you're making an art display. Absolutely. And one of the differences between Clark, who is very dear to Arthur, great friends, and Miranda, is that she's an artist who doesn't care about having her work displayed. She's not interested in an audience for public consumption. She's doing this for her own benefit. He is taking these artifacts for his own benefit because he's terribly lost without the world that he knew. But he turns them into a museum for public consumption. And so he's not an artist. He is a museum director. He's a connoisseur. He's somebody, and as different as they are, Miranda was flourishing and he is not. What they have in common is that they gravitate to art for very different reasons and with very different expectations. One of the things I'll say about utopias and the wish for utopia, because it's relevant to tonight, why do people spend so much time thinking about utopias? Why is it such a great art form? And I mentioned that one of the reasons I think utopias fail is for the same reasons that people invent them. They are deeply or somewhat or slightly unhappy with the way things are. And what is it that allows people, whether an individual or a society of people that get together like Brook Farm and try to make an actual utopian community, or an author, what makes utopias possible? The human imagination. It's one of those things that everything comes back to art. My daughter is a social worker, and she's fond of quoting what they tell you in social work school. It's all social work. Everything you do is social work. I don't argue that that's not true. But imagination is everywhere. And I do think one of the reasons why utopias are so popular is that people can hope for more. I did Oliver Twist with a group some weeks ago, and famously early in the novel, Oliver doesn't get enough gruel. The boys at the table convince him he should ask for more. They know that he'll be slammed down. He says, "Who decides how much food we should get?" And the boys say it's decided by the board. They mean the board of trustees, the board of overseers. But Oliver thinks no person with a heart would ever give us so little food. So the board must be a piece of wood. This enterprise must be overseen by a lump of wood because there's no humanity in this. And what Oliver wants is more. And what most people want is more. And utopia is the great more. I'm not punning on Thomas More. I can't help it that that's his name. But that's what people want. People want something more.
So just as a quick follow-up, that person did say that he meant the question about the role of fear in the broadest sense, so he will hold off till next time.
Okay. And I want to say, if you can tell me that person's name, it may help me remember to invite him or her. Or I'll just say to that person now, not knowing who you are, I'd be very happy if you'd make a point of bringing that question up early next time. Cloud Cuckoo Land has a lot of conflicts and wars in it. And fear plays very prominently in the last sequence of the book. And so that would be a terrific book to focus that question on. And I appreciate the question. I think it's a smart question. I'm not patronizing you. I'd just rather wait till next time, and I appreciate your patience.
Sure. Well, maybe that person will shoot you an email because the way Zoom works with some registrations, it just came up as anonymous. So maybe they'll send you an email just to give you a heads up.
Thomas is one of my favorite people. I read all his stuff. Yeah.
Susan is just commenting. I keep thinking of the short story "The Birthmark" by Hawthorne. I don't know that one.
It's a long time ago since I read it. I never taught it, so I don't remember the significance. Did Susan say more than that?
No, that was her comment.
Yeah. Hawthorne's always a good writer for legacy and influence. Susan, I'm sorry, I don't remember the point. If you want to take some more time in the next few minutes to summarize in a sentence or two the connection, I'd be happy for us to hear it.
The other thing that I can just mention is just because my brain often notices mathematical things when I see them in books. And so you have a virus that kills 99% of the human race. If you think about it, it still means there's 80 million people around, and there's actually more than 3 million of them running around the United States. So it's kind of like a Twilight Zone episode where, Rod Serling brings you into like one street in a neighborhood.
Yeah. Where would Twilight Zone be without a nuclear holocaust or spaceships and aliens? I liked that show as a kid, but it's basically 11 plots and 19 versions of each in some way. But it's not Twilight Zone we have to invoke. It's a Star Trek. It's quite an accomplishment to write an award-winning book that channels both Shakespeare and Gene Roddenberry. survival is not sufficient. And of course, why survival is not sufficient is it goes back to Dickens and Oliver Twist. People want more, and what they want more of is something to do with uh, uh, transcending mere comfort or survival. I quoted the exchange where Lear says to the daughter, I never remember if it's Goneril or Reagan, you offered me 50 soldiers rather than 25. You're twice your sister's love. I'll go back to the offer. I turned you down because you didn't give me 100. But now that your sister offered me only 25, you're looking pretty good. And she says, what do you need any knights and horses for? Anything you want, I give. What do you need that for? And he says in one of the best sequences in the play, oh, reason not the need. Human beings don't just want what they need, they want what they want. And he makes the comment, I know I'm repeating myself from last time, that if she only needed to be warm, she wouldn't need so fancy a dress or coat. People want more than they need. They want what they want. And I do think art is a way to populate the world with things that haven't existed before. There is no Dr. 11. There is no Station 11. And if we step back, there's no Kirsten. There's no Jivan Chaudhuri, which we haven't mentioned yet, transformed from a paparazzo, somebody who is a kind of bottom feeder on celebrity, to a paramedic. I'll point out that his initials are JC. I don't know if that means anything, but there is the couple who have the baby. Their initials, the male and the female, are JC. I don't think this is necessarily a way you have to read a novel. And if I read that the author of the book said she never intended Arthur's name to be a play on art or Leander to be a play on Lear, I would say, I believe you, but the novel says differently. Whether you intended it or not, it's there. And once enough people see it and agree that it's there, the author's intention doesn't matter anymore. That may sound arrogant, but the author's intention is not to interpret the novel. That's for people like us. The author creates it. And if somebody were to say, actually, I had an uncle named Arthur, he's a very dear uncle to me. And when I wrote this novel, I was thinking of him. It had nothing to do with art. I would say, don't you have other relatives? Is he the only beloved relative? Why that person and not others? Maybe subconsciously you picked Arthur. But even if someone were to say to me, no, it's purely accidental, the accidental becomes part of the art. In the same way that if you admire a mural on the side of a building, and there's a fissure in the building from the resettling of the foundation, and the crack in the wall of the building makes sense in the work of art, it becomes part of the work of art, whether it was intended to or not. Wallace Stevens says there is such a thing as found art. You can go out and see a beautiful landscape or seascape or dawn or sunset and feel it has all the requirements of art, even though it was found and not created.
So here's a question from Lynn. So it's let me get through it. It's how does vision, as in seeing a painting, fit in, or hearing, as in listening to music, fit into Station 11, even as in Lear, where one is blinded and another one is deaf to his daughter's message and plea?
Okay, I'm sorry. That's a little bit much for me to process. Would you mind reading it again?
Let me try. Now she sent a rephrase, so let me try her rephrasing. Okay. Asking about the relationship between the loss of sight in Lear and the deafness to a daughter's true message. How does this relate to the vision or seeing of art and painting in 11, and the symphony's inability to see or hear the kindness or generosity or the beauty of art?
The inability to do that?
Yes.
I'm lost by that comment. I will only say that since all art of whatever kind depends upon the senses, whether you're reading a book or listening to a symphony or seeing a painting, or even if you were involved in some kind of tactile art, if there was an installation where you move through a museum in the dark, and I expect that has happened, and you had only to touch things. Obviously, there's a clear connection between the idea of physical sensation, the physical senses, and metaphorical senses. That's why we can talk about an artistic vision. You hear composers or musicians talk about getting exactly the right sound, how much the right taste matters in a culinary work of art. So obviously, there's a very important connection between the physical senses and artistic creation. Art must be created. There must be something created. It doesn't have to be an object or an artifact that continues. It can be a moment. It can be a haiku that is not recorded and is spoken and then it's gone. But there has to be something created for it to be art. And if we accept that, then vision, taste, sound, touch, all that comes into being. And it's not surprising that we would think of vision with a capital V, artistic vision, being something more significant than our everyday vision, the difference between a vision and a daydream, for example. I don't know how responsive that is, and I do want to invite anyone who doesn't get a satisfactory answer to either put the question to me again or send it to me offline, online through my email, which has changed from last year, remember.
Yes, I passed your new email on to a handful of people, and I'm happy to do it.
So one of the things that's said in the novel, and I confess I couldn't find it this afternoon where I thought I had marked it, that being alive is a risk. Not being alive in a dangerous landscape, not being alive post-apocalyptically, not being alive when a pandemic may hit again, just being alive is a risk. And a couple of weeks ago, at the Westport Library, October is my busiest month. I'm all over the map. I did a talk on Mrs. Dalloway, where the novelist, or narrator rather, says about Mrs. Dalloway that she realized that it was a very, very dangerous thing to live even one day. Now, Mrs. Dalloway is what used to be called a middle aged society matron. She spent the bulk of the short novel thinking about preparing for a party for important people. Her husband's an important person. Her daughter is going to be at the party, and so is her old lover. And most of it is interior monologue. She's putting on a party. And people who knew Virginia Woolf somewhat, but didn't know her well, thought when they read the novel that Virginia Woolf, this high minded, imaginative novelist, could not possibly be writing Mrs. Dalloway as a protagonist of a novel without treating her satirically. And they misread the novel to think that Virginia Woolf was somehow looking down or demeaning Mrs. Dalloway. Had they known her better, that is, had they known Virginia Woolf better, or had they known that in her diaries, her commonplace book, that is not a diary of this is what I did today, but thoughts and ideas and expressions and things she read in other people's writings that gave her some inspiration. She used the metaphor of a hostess as what an artist does when she writes a novel, and she talks in the she gender because she's a woman. That all that a novelist can do in the disjointed modern era after the First World War, Mrs. Dalloway is published in 1925, is to compose and bring people together. They cannot create a realistic, cartoonish, ebullient world of characters like Dickens. They can't do sharp, witty social commentary like Jane Austen. All they can hope to do, says Virginia Woolf, offline, is make a place where people can come together and for a moment see people compose, see a picture, a social event, get a sense of character, pulling herself together. I have always believed that one of the most accurate metaphors is when someone feels that life is so difficult for them that they feel that they're all scattered and that they have to pull themselves together, they have to concentrate. That always seemed very accurate for the way you sometimes feel that you're scattered. Um, and her novel was an attempt to host people coming together in the novel, experiencing something together, and then leaving without any necessary without necessarily giving a great moral lesson. And I do think that part of this novel is to recognize how hard it is to compose yourself. And so when the novelist says of Virginia Woolf, what a dangerous thing it is to live even one day, I think what she meant was that it's dangerous partly because you may love it too much. Look at all the things, the secret things that Arthur loved, from croissants and magnolias to people who were beloved by him, and that he didn't share with anyone, that were part of the life that he valued as a regular person rather than as a celebrity. It's also a dangerous thing because you realize those things can be taken away, and that if you live with the attitude that the bomb can go off at any time, a pandemic can return, that when your son or daughter or niece or nephew gets their driver's license, they're now living in danger of death all the time. There is a way in which everyday life can be a risk, can be dangerous, because it can be taken away. But there's also, alongside, not contradictory, but complementary, the idea that if you really want to live, be alive, you have to risk putting yourself out there. You have to risk involvement. And one of the things about Arthur that makes him maybe not a tragic hero, but a sad case is he's invested so much of his energy in acting and not people. Serial wives, which may be for reasons more than sex, but clearly aren't what most people think of as why you get married. And the one love of his life is a boy who, whatever attention or inattention he got, and I'm not blaming the parent, becomes the most negative character in the book. So it is a risk to be alive. I can tell you now the alternative's no cakewalk either. So hang in there, people.
Okay, why don't you just continue, Mark?
Okay, well, so you might think that the novel would end with the idea of Kirsten seeing those lights of the southern city and moving towards them. And Severn City is no actual city. Mandel said that she just picked a name and she didn't say exactly where it was, but she wanted a fictional city. And what she wisely does, um, the author, is she goes back to Arthur pre-death and gives you that insight. If you want to reread that chapter, chapter 53, it's only a few pages. And then she excerpts in 54 an episode from uh, Dr. 11, in which death seemed like an awakening. And that's a half page, and that might be worth your reviewing. And only then, when she revisits Arthur, who is real, and Dr. 11, who is not, only then does she return to the traveling symphony, setting out from the airport on a bright morning in September. And Kirsten says it's not our usual territory, so they're going into a strange new world, a brave new world. She mentions wanting to make sure that there's always one copy of the graphic novel at the museum for safekeeping. It mentions that they now travel with weapons and music, so they have instruments and music well. Clark reads through part of the graphic novel that was left in his care, and he realizes it's channeling a party that he was at. and that he and Miranda are characters who are recognizable. He says in the middle of unnumbered page 332, that he hadn't thought of Miranda in a long time. All these ghosts. Well, the ghosts, and I've said this before as recently as just last time, that a ghost is a presence of an absence. When you ask the question, what became of Miranda, Miranda is back in your life as an absence. And even though he might not know where she is, partly she's in the book he's reading, the graphic novel he's reading, but even to ask the question, whatever became of her, is to be revisited by her, even if only in her absence. Her absence becomes present. Think about all the people you've known in your life, schoolmates whose names not only can't you don't remember them. You can't even say, that was that redheaded girl with ponytails, what was her name again? The number of people that were important to us, or somewhat important to us at one time, who are just gone. Those people are not ghosts. They're blank pages. But once you remember them, even to the point of saying whatever became of her, they become ghosts in a positive sense. Those artifacts that Clark puts into the Museum of Civilization, partly make a kind of ghostly civilization. They are the presence of absences. In the fullness of time, some people won't know what a cell phone is. What is that thing? There was some game show, I forgot which, I got a Secret What Island or something. They would bring out unusual farm instruments or contraptions and ask the panelists to get what it was used for, because it was so unusual. So part of what this scene of his visiting the comic book is having him think about ghosts in a new way, to think about Miranda and not just the things about life that he misses. And then it says, and I'm going to read this last paragraph. I think I have time to do this. Yeah, this is how the novel ends. Clark looks up at the evening activity on the tarmac, at the planes that have been grounded for 20 years, the reflection of his candle flickering in the glass. He has no expectation of seeing an airplane rise again in his lifetime, but is it possible that somewhere there are ships setting out? To ask that question is to imagine. He has no data about it. That question is an act of imagination. If there are again towns with streetlights, if there are symphonies and newspapers, then what else might this awakening world contain? That's an invitation to your imagination. Perhaps vessels are setting out even now, traveling toward or away from him, steered by sailors armed with maps and knowledge of the stars, driven by need, or perhaps simply by curiosity. There's imagination again. Whatever became of the countries on the other side, another question that brings those countries into his imagination. If nothing else, it's pleasant to consider the possibility. He likes the thought of ships moving over water toward another world just out of sight. That pleasure of liking what's just out of sight is part of what animates all utopias. People who like to read about them, people who like to create them, get pleasure out of thinking, what's on the other side of the wall of existence? What might I imagine that doesn't exist yet? Tolstoy is credited with saying, he may not have said this, but it's so good, I quote him anyways, that he looked around the world and saw no one quite like Anna Karenina, so he made her. He filled in the gap of the absence of Anna Karenina. So I hope that's a good note to end on. And I do invite questions that didn't get answered to be sent to me, either to be answered one-on-one by email, or that I'll share with the group next time when we meet for Cloud Cuckoo Land.
Thanks, Mark. I think that was great. And as I said, folks, if you don't have Mark's email already, just shoot me an email and I'll send it right back to you. Otherwise, remember, we're taking a couple weeks off and we'll see you on Thursday, November 2.
And if I can just say as a PS, it's worth remembering that Shakespeare lived through a plague, a quite significant plague in his lifetime. Thank you all, and thank you, Michael, as always.
Right. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in first week in November.